Some people arrive at your door carrying trouble. Others arrive carrying the part of you that died years ago. The wind screamed across Dust Creek hard enough to shake the cabin shutters loose when Elias Whitaker heard the coughing outside. Not the dry cough of a drunk cowboy stumbling home from the saloon. This sounded deeper, colder, like lungs filling with winter air. Elias sat motionless beside the fire for 3 long seconds, one rough hand wrapped around a tin coffee cup gone cold hours ago. Nobody came this far north unless they were lost, desperate, or dangerous. Usually all three. The old floorboards groaned beneath his boots as he crossed the cabin. His shotgun leaned beside the door exactly where it had leaned every night for the past 12 years. Out here, a man either learned caution or ended up buried beneath frozen dirt with nobody left to remember his name. The moment Elias pulled open the door, the storm shoved dust and freezing air into the cabin like a living thing. At first he saw nothing except darkness and sand swirling beneath the moonlight. Then lightning flashed somewhere far across the plains, and he spotted her collapsed beside the porch steps. A woman, Apache, thin shoulders trembling beneath a torn brown blanket. One hand clutching an old black cooking pot against her chest so tightly her knuckles looked pale beneath the dirt. Elias kept one hand on the shotgun. "You planning on dying on my porch?" he asked quietly. The woman lifted her head slowly. Her dark hair stuck against one side of her face where an old burn scar disappeared beneath her cheekbone and down her neck. But her eyes weren't broken. Tired, yes. Hungry, definitely. But not broken. She looked at him the way starving people look at bread sitting behind glass. Close enough to smell it. Too proud to beg for it. "I'm not worth much, sir," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the storm itself. "But I can cook." Elias frowned slightly. Strange answer. Most people asked for food first. Or water. Or mercy. She asked for usefulness. The woman tried to stand, then nearly collapsed again, coughing into her sleeve. The cooking pot slipped from her hands for half a second before she grabbed it again with sudden panic, like losing that pot would somehow finish her. Elias stared at the burned iron surface. Black soot covered the sides, old and layered deep, as if it had survived years of smoke and fire. Something about it bothered him immediately, though he couldn't say why. "What's your name?" he asked. "Naelli." "You alone?" She hesitated too long before answering. "Now I am." The wind rattled the porch again. Somewhere in the darkness, Elias heard loose fence wire clanging against wood. He should have shut the door. Should have given her directions to the church shelter 12 miles south. Should have remembered every bad thing that happened the last time he let strangers inside his life. Instead, he stepped aside from the doorway. "Horse sheds warmer than freezing to death," he muttered. Naelli looked at him carefully, almost suspicious of kindness itself. Then she nodded once and rose slowly to her feet. Elias noticed she limped slightly as she crossed the porch. Not badly, just enough to tell a story she wasn't ready to explain. Inside the cabin, the fire cracked low and orange against the stone hearth while dust whispered against the windows. Naelli stood near the door holding that old cooking pot against her chest, as if it belonged to someone she missed. Elias pointed toward the small stove. "You hungry?" Her eyes moved to the pot, then back to him. "If you've got flour," she said softly, "I can make enough stew to last you 3 days." Elias almost laughed at that. There wasn't enough food in the cabin to last himself 2 more winters, let alone strangers. But something in her voice carried certainty, confidence. Like cooking was the last piece of herself the world hadn't managed to take away. Then lightning flashed again through the cabin window, and for one quick second Elias saw something outside near the fence line. A rider, motionless in the storm, watching the cabin. The rider vanished the moment lightning disappeared, leaving only darkness beyond the fence line and the sound of wind dragging dust across the frozen ground. Elias stood near the window for another few seconds, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his old hat, trying to decide whether he had truly seen someone or whether loneliness had finally started playing tricks on him. Behind him, the cabin filled slowly with the smell of onions and garlic sizzling inside cast iron. Real food, warm food, the kind of smell that belonged to families, not forgotten men hiding from the world 30 miles from the nearest church bell. Elias turned slowly toward the stove. Naelli moved quietly through the tiny kitchen as though she had lived there for years. She had rolled up the sleeves of the oversized work shirt he gave her, and her thin hands moved with calm precision while steam curled around her face in the lantern light. She wasted nothing. Not the last potatoes. Not the dried carrots. Not even the small strip of salt pork hanging beside the window. Every motion carried care. Respect. Elias noticed she stirred the stew counterclockwise with the wooden spoon, the same way his wife used to years ago before the fire took everything from him except silence. The thought hit him hard enough to stop his breathing for half a second. Naelli glanced over her shoulder. "Something wrong?" she asked softly. Elias cleared his throat. "No," but his voice sounded rougher than usual. She did not press further. That surprised him more than the cooking. Most people talked too much around silence because silence made them nervous. Naelli seemed to understand it. The fire cracked low inside the stove while snow began mixing with dust outside, tapping softly against the cabin windows. After a while, Naelli filled a bowl and placed it carefully in front of him at the table. Elias stared down at it suspiciously. Thick stew. Fresh bread somehow baked from scraps he would have sworn were useless 2 hours earlier. "You made all this from what was left in my pantry." Naelli sat slowly near the stove but did not touch her own bowl yet. "My grandmother used to say hungry people throw away meals every day because they only see ingredients." Elias grunted quietly. "Your grandmother sounds smarter than most preachers." For the first time, a faint smile touched Naelli's face. Small. Gone almost immediately. But real. Elias lifted the spoon slowly. The moment he tasted the stew, something inside his chest tightened painfully. Not because of the food itself, because he remembered this feeling. Warmth inside a home, while winter tried clawing through the walls outside. His wife humming near the stove. Small boots running across the floorboards. Laughter that no longer existed anywhere except his memory. Elias lowered the spoon carefully before his hands betrayed him. Naelli watched him in silence for a moment. Then she looked away on purpose, giving him privacy inside his grief. That single act unsettled him more than tears would have. Most people looked at broken men with pity. She looked at him with understanding. The lantern flickered as wind rattled the roof again. Then came the sound. A horse snorting somewhere outside near the barn. Elias rose immediately, one hand reaching for the shotgun leaning beside the door. Naelli stiffened near the stove, but said nothing. Elias moved toward the window and carefully lifted the curtain edge with 2 fingers. Nothing. Only darkness swallowing the ranch beneath the storm. Then he saw fresh hoofprints cutting through the snow near the fence. His jaw tightened. Someone had circled the cabin recently. Watching. Waiting. Behind him, Naelli spoke quietly without turning around. "If someone followed me here," she whispered, "I am sorry." Elias kept staring out into the black prairie. "Funny thing about trouble," he muttered. "It usually shows up long before people apologize for it." Then his eyes drifted downward toward the burned cooking pot resting beside the stove. In the flickering firelight, he finally noticed faded letters scratched into the iron beneath years of soot. Ash River. The name scratched into the black iron pot sat in Elias Whitaker's mind all night like a nail driven into old wood. Ash River. He had not spoken those words out loud in 15 years. Not after the fire. Not after the smoke swallowed half the valley and left behind nothing except blackened beams and ghosts nobody wanted to discuss. By sunrise, the storm had passed, leaving the prairie buried beneath a thin crust of snow that glittered pale gold under the morning sun. Elias stepped onto the porch holding a steaming cup of coffee while cold air rolled across the ranch in slow waves. The world looked peaceful again. Too peaceful. The kind of silence that usually meant people were talking somewhere else. Behind him, Naelli quietly swept ashes from beside the stove. She had already repaired a broken cabinet hinge using leather straps from her own worn bag. She moved around the cabin carefully, never touching Elias's private things, never asking questions about the framed photograph turned face down near the fireplace. Most people would have picked it up by now out of curiosity. She had not even looked at it twice. That bothered Elias more than if she had. Around mid-morning, he saddled his horse for town. He needed flour, lamp oil, and answers. Naelli stood near the cabin doorway as he tightened the saddle straps. "I can stay out of sight while you are gone," she offered quietly. Elias glanced toward her. "This ranch is not a prison." She lowered her eyes slightly. "No," she said softly. "Just trying not to bring more trouble." Elias mounted the horse without answering. Dust Creek sat 12 miles south beneath low gray hills and tired winter skies. Small town. Small minds. The kind of place where people remembered your mistakes longer than your kindness. The moment Elias pushed open the saloon doors, conversations slowed. Not stopped completely. Just enough. Enough for a man to feel it in his bones. Old Hank behind the counter wiped a glass slowly while studying Elias beneath thick gray eyebrows. "Heard you brought company home," Hank muttered. Elias removed his gloves one finger at a time. Town gossip getting faster than trains now. Nobody laughed. A ranch hand near the window leaned back in his chair. Not every day a man hides an Apache woman in his cabin. Elias turned his eyes toward the man calmly. Not every day grown men concern themselves with lonely women trying to survive winter either. The ranch hand looked away first. That surprised everybody in the room. Then Sheriff Wallace entered through the front doors carrying snow on his boots and caution in his tired face. He walked straight toward Elias. "Need a word outside." Elias sighed. Softly. "Coffee first." "Now." The sheriff's voice stayed low, but firm enough to pull every eye in the saloon toward them. Outside, cold wind rolled dirt along the street, while horses shifted beside the hitching posts. Sheriff Wallace kept his hands near his coat pockets instead of his gun belt. "Nervous habit. People are talking," he said. Elias lit a cigarette slowly. "You already mentioned that." "No," Wallace muttered. "I mean people are asking questions about her." Elias exhaled smoke into the freezing air. "And?" The sheriff hesitated before speaking again. "A trader rode through town this morning asking about a woman carrying an old black cooking pot." Elias felt something tighten inside his chest. "What trader?" "Did not catch the name." Wallace lowered his voice further. But when Hank mentioned the words Ash River, that man nearly dropped his coffee cup. The wind shifted hard enough to rattle the saloon windows behind them. Elias stared across the street toward the church steeple rising over Dust Creek. 15 years buried beneath silence. 15 years avoiding questions nobody could answer. And suddenly strangers were following hoofprints through snow because of a burned cooking pot. Then Sheriff Wallace spoke the one sentence Elias did not expect. "Whatever that woman is running from," he said quietly, "I do not think she stole it. I think she survived it." By the time Elias rode back toward the ranch, the winter sun had already started sinking behind the hills, painting the snow gold and copper beneath the fading light. Sheriff Wallace's words followed him the entire ride home like a second shadow. "I do not think she stole it. I think she survived it." Elias tightened his jaw against the cold wind. Survived what exactly? Ash River had become one of those names people stopped speaking after enough years passed. The kind of tragedy buried beneath dust because nobody wanted to remember who failed to stop it. But Elias remembered. He remembered smoke thick enough to turn daylight black. He remembered standing knee-deep in snow outside a burning house while neighbors shouted and horses panicked in the dark. Most of all, he remembered the feeling. Afterward, silence. The kind that crawled into a man's bones and stayed there for the rest of his life. When the ranch finally appeared in the distance, Elias immediately noticed something wrong. The cabin chimney still smoked steadily, but fresh horse tracks circled the property. More than one rider this time. He dismounted fast, boots crunching against frozen dirt while one hand drifted near the revolver at his hip out of habit. The cabin door opened before he reached it. Naelli stepped onto the porch holding his old wool coat folded carefully in her arms. Her eyes moved toward the tracks behind him first. "Someone came while you were gone," she said quietly. Elias stopped halfway up the porch steps. "How many?" "2 men." Her voice remained calm, but her fingers tightened slightly around the coat. "One stayed on horseback. The other asked questions." Elias felt cold settle deeper beneath his ribs. "What kind of questions?" Naelli hesitated. "Questions about the cooking pot." The wind moved softly through the fence posts, while somewhere nearby a horse snorted inside the barn. Elias climbed onto the porch slowly, eyes studying her face beneath the fading evening light. "Did you answer them?" "No." "Did they threaten you?" Naelli lowered her gaze briefly. Men do not always need threats to make women uncomfortable. That answer sat heavy between them. Elias looked past her into the warm cabin, where stew still simmered softly over the stove. For one strange second, the sight of that firelight beside her silhouette made the ranch feel less empty than it had in years. That frightened him more than the riders. Inside, Naelli quietly poured coffee into 2 cups while Elias removed his gloves near the stove. He watched her carefully now, not with suspicion anymore, with questions. Questions she clearly carried like stones in her chest. Finally, Elias spoke. You knew Ash River before the fire. Naelli froze only slightly. Barely noticeable, but enough. The lantern flame flickered gold against the old burn scar along her neck, while silence stretched through the cabin. Then she nodded once. My father traded there sometimes, she said softly. Elias leaned against the table. That is not what I asked. Another long pause. Naelli stared into her coffee cup as if memories lived somewhere inside the dark surface. There was a little Apache girl, she whispered at last. People blamed her after the fire. Elias frowned slowly. Blamed her for what? Naelli swallowed carefully before answering. For surviving when others did not. The words landed harder than any confession could have. Outside, the wind rattled the loose shutters while dusk swallowed the prairie whole. Elias suddenly remembered something he had not thought about in 15 years. The night of the fire, somebody had mentioned seeing a child running near the trees. Small, frightened, wrapped in smoke. Nobody ever found her afterward. Elias looked toward Naelli again, really looked this time. The scar on her neck, the caution in her voice, the way she carried that burned cooking pot like it belonged to dead people. Then he noticed her hands trembling slightly around the coffee cup for the first time since she arrived. Naelli, he said quietly, were you there that night? She opened her mouth to answer. Before a single word came out, 3 loud knocks echoed against the cabin door. The knocking came again, slow and heavy this time, carrying the kind of confidence that did not belong to travelers asking for shelter. Elias Whitaker moved toward the door without hurry, but every muscle in his shoulders tightened beneath his coat. Across the room, Naelli slowly set down her coffee cup beside the stove. The lantern light caught fear in her eyes for the first time since arriving at the ranch. Not panic, recognition. Elias noticed it immediately. Outside, the wind dragged snow across the porch boards in long scraping whispers while the horses in the barn shifted uneasily. Elias opened the door halfway, keeping one hand low near his revolver. 2 men stood beneath the porch roof. One tall and clean-shaven, wearing a dark wool coat too expensive for Dust Creek. The other shorter, older, with sharp eyes and tobacco stains on his gloves. Both smelled like horses and cold air. The taller man smiled politely, though nothing warm lived behind it. Evening, he said. Name is Walter Grin. We are looking for someone. Elias leaned one shoulder against the doorway. Ain't everybody. Walter's smile thinned slightly. Apache woman. Traveling alone. Carrying a burned cooking pot. Behind Elias, the cabin went completely still. Even the stew simmering over the stove sounded louder suddenly. Elias studied the men without blinking. And why exactly are 2 strangers hunting women in winter storms? The older man answered this time. Because that woman belongs to a story people buried years ago. Elias felt the words settle cold inside his chest. Walter Grin removed his gloves slowly, eyes drifting past Elias toward the warm cabin light behind him. Truth is, he continued softly, we are not looking to harm her. We simply need confirmation. Confirmation of what? Walter hesitated just long enough to feel dangerous. That she survived the Ash River fire. Silence stretched across the porch. Somewhere far out on the prairie, a coyote cried into the freezing dark. Elias glanced once over his shoulder. Naelli stood motionless beside the stove, her face pale beneath the lantern glow. She looked smaller somehow. Not weak, just tired of running from memories that refused to stay buried. Walter noticed her then. His expression changed instantly. Not surprise. Recognition. Dear Lord, he whispered. It really is her. Elias stepped fully into the doorway now, blocking their view. You know her? Walter looked back toward him carefully. No, but I knew her father. Those words struck Naelli harder than a slap ever could. Elias heard her sharp breath behind him. Walter lowered his voice. Her father traded supplies through Ash River for years. Honest man. Quiet. Kept mostly to himself because towns back then did not trust Apache families much. The older man beside him spat into the snow. Still do not. Walter ignored him. Night of the fire, he continued. People said the little Apache girl disappeared. Some believed she died. Others blamed her for bringing bad luck. Naelli finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Children do not bring fire. Walter's eyes softened slightly. No, he said quietly. Men usually do. Elias looked between them carefully now. Pieces of an old puzzle shifting slowly into place. What really happened in Ash River? He asked. Walter removed his hat, exposing silver hair damp from snow. That depends who tells it. The wind pushed hard against the porch again, while lantern light flickered behind Elias like restless ghosts. Walter glanced toward the burned cooking pot sitting near the stove. But I know one thing, he said. That pot belonged to the Ash River kitchen before the fire. Naelli lowered her eyes toward the floorboards. Elias noticed her hands trembling again. Then Walter spoke the sentence that changed everything inside the cabin. And if she still carries it after all these years, he murmured softly, then somebody in that fire mattered enough for her never to let go. The two men left just before midnight, their horses disappearing into the snow-covered dark while the sound of hooves faded slowly across the prairie. But the warmth they carried into the cabin with their questions stayed behind long after they vanished. Elias sat alone at the kitchen table, one rough hand resting beside his untouched coffee while the lantern flame trembled softly between him and Naelli. Neither spoke for a long while. Outside, winter pressed against the cabin walls with cold patience. Inside, memories pressed harder. Naelli finally reached for the burned cooking pot beside the stove and ran her fingers gently along the black iron surface. My mother used to make bread in this, she whispered. Elias lifted his eyes toward her. You never mentioned your mother. A faint sadness crossed Naelli's face like a shadow passing over still water. Some memories survive better when they stay quiet. Elias understood that better than most people alive. The ranch had been silent for 12 years because silence hurt less than remembering voices that no longer existed. He studied her carefully in the lantern glow. The scar on her neck, the exhaustion hidden beneath her calm, the way she still sat near the edge of her chair as if prepared to leave at any moment. Like life had taught her not to belong anywhere too long. Finally, Elias spoke. Were you there that night? Naelli did. Not pretend not to understand. Her eyes remained fixed on the pot, while snow whispered against the windows. Yes, she answered softly. Elias felt something inside him tighten. How old were you? 9. 9 years old. Elias leaned back slowly in his chair, staring into the fire. He remembered hearing someone mention a child after the fire. Small footprints in melted snow near the trees. A frightened girl nobody could find afterward. Most folks assumed she wandered into the wilderness and froze before sunrise. Others blamed her family because blame always traveled easier than truth. What happened? Elias asked quietly. Naelli closed her eyes for a moment before answering. The town blamed my father for many things back then, she said. Being Apache made it easy for people to believe lies. The lantern crackled softly beside them. But my father still traded fairly. Still helped people during winter. Even the ones who looked at him like he did not belong. Elias lowered his gaze toward the table. He had seen that look before. Hell, he had probably worn it himself once upon a time. Naelli continued carefully, like each word carried weight. The night of the fire, my father rode to Ash River because someone sent for help. There was smoke everywhere when we arrived. Her voice trembled slightly now, though she fought to hide it. People were screaming. Horses running loose. I remember snow turning gray from ash falling out of the sky. Elias could almost see it again himself. Naelli swallowed hard before continuing. My father told me to stay near the supply wagon. But then, she stopped. Silence stretched painfully between them. Elias waited. Finally she whispered. I heard a little boy crying inside one of the houses. Elias's chest tightened instantly. Naelli looked up toward him now, her dark eyes full of memories she had carried alone too many years. My father ran into the fire without thinking. He brought the child out alive. Elias stopped breathing for half a second. A boy. Naelli nodded once. Small. Blonde hair. Maybe 5 years old. The room suddenly felt smaller. Hotter. Elias gripped the edge of the table beneath his hand. His son. Dear God. His son. Naelli continued softly, unaware of the storm breaking apart inside him. Afterward, people began shouting that my father started the fire himself. Somebody pointed at me and called us cursed. Her voice cracked slightly now. My father pushed the cooking pot into my hands and told me to run before fear made people cruel. Elias stared at her in complete silence while the fire snapped low inside the stove. 12 years of grief. 15 years of unanswered questions. And now the woman sitting across from him carried the last memory of the night his world burned apart. Then Naelli looked at him carefully, and whispered the words that hollowed the air between them completely. "The little boy my father saved," she said softly. "His last name was Whitaker." The fire inside the stove cracked softly while Elias Whitaker sat frozen at the kitchen table, staring at the woman across from him like the world had suddenly shifted beneath his boots. For years he had replayed that night inside his mind 1,000 different ways. Smoke swallowing the valley. Neighbors shouting through snow. The sound of his little boy coughing in his arms afterward, while doctors prayed the smoke had not ruined his lungs forever. But never once had Elias imagined that the frightened Apache child blamed for the fire would someday sit inside his cabin feeding him warm stew beside a lantern flame. Naelli lowered her eyes after speaking his last name aloud, almost as though she regretted saying it. "I did not know it was you," she whispered. Elias leaned back slowly, one rough hand covering his mouth, while silence pressed heavy against the room. Then he laughed once under his breath. Not because anything felt funny, because sometimes pain arrived so strangely a man forgot what else to do with it. "My son survived," he said finally, voice rough with memory. Naelli nodded carefully. "Your father held him after the smoke cleared." "I remember that." Elias swallowed hard. "You remember my father?" Tall man, gray beard, missing 2 fingers on his left hand. Elias stared at her in disbelief because that description fit perfectly. "He thanked my father that night," Naelli continued softly. "But when people started blaming us for the fire, your father tried to stop them." Elias closed his eyes briefly. That sounded like his father too. Stubborn enough to stand against angry crowds even when nobody else would. The lantern flickered low while snow drifted softly against the cabin windows. Finally, Elias spoke again. "My father died 2 winters after Ash River." Naelli's expression softened with quiet sadness. "I am sorry." Elias nodded once. "My boy too." The words landed heavily between them. Naelli looked down immediately, her fingers tightening around the edge of the old cooking pot. "Fever," Elias muttered. 3 years after the fire. His voice remained calm, but only because grief old enough becomes quieter instead of smaller. Naelli lowered her head. "Your father saved us from blame that night," Elias continued slowly. "And your father saved my son from the fire." He stared toward the flames inside the stove. "Funny thing is, nobody ever told the story right afterward." Naelli gave a faint, bitter smile. "People tell stories that help them sleep at night." Elias looked toward her again. "So what happened after you ran?" Naelli hesitated. Then she answered honestly. "My father sent me north with traders before sunrise. Said fear was spreading too fast." Her eyes drifted toward the snow outside. "He stayed behind because he thought truth would protect him." Elias already knew from her silence what came next. Truth had not protected him. The cabin fell quiet again except for the low whistle of winter whined through the roof beams. Then suddenly the horses outside began shifting nervously in the barn. Elias stood instantly. Naelli looked toward the window. Lantern light moved outside near the fence line. More than one lantern. Elias reached for the shotgun beside the door while bootsteps crunched through snow toward the porch. Voices followed. Angry voices this time. "Whitaker!" someone shouted through the dark. "Bring out the Apache woman." Naelli's face drained pale. Elias moved toward the window carefully and lifted the curtain edge. Nearly a dozen men stood outside the ranch carrying lanterns against the snowstorm. Ranch hands. Miners. Town drunks brave. Only when standing together. Sheriff Wallace stood near the back looking exhausted rather than angry. Walter Grin was there too, his jaw tight beneath his scarf. Elias lowered the curtain slowly. "Looks like Dust Creek finally remembered how to hate somebody," he muttered. Naelli rose from her chair quietly. "I will leave," she whispered immediately. "No." The word came out harder than Elias intended. Naelli stared at him in surprise. Elias tightened his grip on the shotgun, but did not raise it. "You spent 15 years carrying ghosts that belonged to other people," he said quietly. "You are not walking back into the cold because this town needs somebody to blame again." Outside, another fist pounded against the cabin door hard enough to shake the walls. Then a voice shouted through the storm. "We know who she is now, Whitaker, and you do not either." The pounding against the cabin door continued while lantern light flickered through the cracks in the walls like restless fireflies trapped in a storm. Elias Whitaker stood motionless near the entrance, one hand resting on the shotgun beside him, though the barrel remained pointed toward the floorboards. Across the room, Naelli quietly backed away from the windows. her face pale beneath the lantern glow. Not because she feared death. Elias could see it clearly now. She feared becoming the reason another home filled with smoke and shouting. Outside, the men of Dust Creek shifted impatiently in the snow, boots scraping frozen dirt while horses snorted clouds into the freezing dark. "Whitaker," somebody shouted again. "You hiding her in there or not?" Elias finally opened the door halfway. Winter wind rushed inside immediately, carrying snowflakes and the sharp smell of whiskey from the crowd outside. Nearly a dozen men stood facing the cabin with lanterns swinging in their hands. Some angry, some nervous, most simply afraid of things they did not understand. Sheriff Wallace remained near the back, his tired eyes locked on Elias like a man already regretting the night. Walter Grin stood beside him with his coat collar pulled high against the cold. Elias stepped onto the porch slowly. "Bit late for social visits," he muttered. A broad ranch hand named Curtis stepped forward first. "We heard the Apache woman from Ash River is hiding here." Elias said nothing. Curtis pointed toward the cabin. "People in town remember what happened after that fire." Walter Grin spoke sharply before Elias could answer. "No, Curtis. People remember rumors." The ranch hand ignored him completely. "Ever since she showed up, strangers been riding through town asking questions. Folks are nervous." Elias looked over the crowd one face at a time. Men he had traded cattle with for years. Men who nodded politely at church on Sundays. Men who suddenly looked braver, standing shoulder to shoulder in the snow. "Funny thing about nervous people," Elias said quietly. "They usually become dangerous before they become honest." The wind whistled hard through the fence posts while silence spread uneasily across the yard. Then Curtis spoke again. "You do not know who she really is." Elias leaned one shoulder against the porch beam. "Seems to me none of you ever bothered finding out." Sheriff Wallace finally stepped forward. "Elias," he said carefully, "somebody spread word in town that the Ash River fire was no accident." Elias frowned slightly. "And?" Wallace hesitated before answering. "And some people believe her father started it." Behind Elias, Naelli quietly closed her eyes. Elias heard the movement even over the wind. Walter Grin suddenly removed his gloves and stepped into the lantern light. "That is a lie," he said firmly. Several heads turned toward him in surprise. Walter pointed toward the cabin. "That Apache man saved lives that night, including Whitaker's boy." Murmurs spread instantly through the crowd. Curtis shook his head. "Then why did the girl disappear?" Walter's expression darkened. "Because grown men blamed a child for surviving." Nobody answered immediately after that. The storm creaked softly through the old barn while lantern flames bent in the wind. Elias stepped fully onto the porch now, tall and steady against the cold. "You all want truth?" he asked quietly. "Truth is that woman inside spent 15 years carrying shame that never belonged to her." His eyes moved across the crowd. Slowly. "Meanwhile, this town carried lies because lies were easier." Sheriff Wallace lowered his gaze toward the snow. Curtis clenched his jaw stubbornly. "Still does not explain who caused the fire." Before anyone else could speak, Naelli stepped into the doorway behind Elias. No coat. No fear left to hide. Just exhaustion. The lantern light touched the old scar along her neck while snow drifted softly around the porch. "My father did not start that fire," she said quietly. Her voice was not loud, but every man heard it. "He died trying to save people from it." Silence swallowed the ranch. Even the horses seemed to stop moving. Then Walter Grin looked toward the crowd with something close to disgust in his eyes. "You all spent 15 years hunting the wrong ghost," he muttered. Elias felt the cold tighten around the yard while every face shifted uneasily beneath lantern light. Because deep down, the men standing outside that cabin suddenly realized something far worse than an Apache woman surviving Ash River. Somebody else had been responsible all along. The crowd outside Elias Whitaker's ranch no longer looked angry after Naelli spoke. Angry men stand tall. These men stood uncertain now, shifting their boots in the snow while cold wind moved through the prairie grass around them. Fear had carried them there. Truth suddenly left them nowhere to place it. Sheriff Wallace removed his hat slowly, rubbing one tired hand across his forehead while lantern light flickered over faces that no longer knew where to look. Walter Grin stepped forward first. "I spent years hearing stories about Ash River," he said quietly. "Funny thing is, every version changed depending on who felt guilty telling it." Nobody answered. Curtis stared at the frozen ground beneath his boots as if ashamed to lift his eyes again. Naelli remained standing in the cabin doorway behind Elias, one hand resting lightly against the old burned cooking pot beside her. The wind pulled strands of dark hair across the scar along her neck, but she did not hide from anyone anymore. She looked tired, not frightened, just tired of carrying other people's lies through half her life. Elias glanced toward her, briefly, then back at the men crowding his yard. "If you all came here looking for someone to blame," he said quietly, "you are about 15 years too late." Sheriff Wallace finally stepped closer onto the porch. "There is something else," he admitted carefully. Elias frowned. Wallace looked toward Walter Grin before continuing. "The county records from Ash River disappeared shortly after the fire." Murmurs spread softly through the crowd again. Walter nodded once. "Land deeds, too." Elias felt something cold settle inside him. "Somebody profited from that fire," he muttered. Walter's expression darkened beneath the lantern glow. "A ranching company bought most of Ash River less than 6 months later for almost nothing." Silence followed those words. Not shocked silence. The worst kind. The kind where pieces suddenly fit together too well. Curtis looked toward Naelli uneasily. "So, all these years," he could not finish the sentence. "Naelli did it for him." People blamed the easiest target. Her voice carried no anger now. Somehow that hurt more. Elias watched the men outside carefully. Nobody carried hatred in their eyes anymore. Only discomfort, regret, the understanding that fear had once turned an innocent child into a ghost story they passed between themselves for 15 years. Finally, Sheriff Wallace cleared his throat quietly. "Miss Naelli," he said, "you have my word nobody in Dust Creek will trouble you again." Naelli looked at him for a long moment before answering softly. "That is kind, Sheriff. But people usually keep fearing things after the truth comes out. They just fear themselves instead." Wallace lowered his eyes because he knew she was right. One by one, the men slowly returned to their horses. No shouting, no threats, just tired silence and cold wind beneath the lanterns. Walter Grin paused before mounting his horse and looked toward Naelli carefully. "Your father deserved better than the story they gave him," he said. Naelli nodded faintly. "So did yours," she answered. Walter tipped his hat once before riding into the dark with the others. Soon only hoofbeats remained, fading slowly into the winter night until silence reclaimed the ranch. Again, Elias stood on the porch beside Naelli while snow drifted softly across the empty yard. Neither spoke for a while. The storm had passed. The sky above the prairie looked clear enough to freeze stars solid. Finally, Naelli stepped back inside the cabin and placed the cooking pot gently near the stove. "I should leave before morning," she whispered. Elias frowned immediately. "Why?" She kept her eyes lowered. "Because this place belonged to your memories long before I arrived." Elias looked around the cabin quietly. Same table, same fire, same silence he had lived beside for 12 years. Yet somehow nothing felt as empty anymore. He walked slowly toward the stove and picked up the bowl she had left drying beside the sink. "Funny thing about memories," he murmured. "They stop haunting a man so much once somebody finally shares them." Naelli looked up at him then. Really looked at him. Elias set the bowl down carefully before speaking again. "Kitchen gets cold awful fast without someone cooking in it." For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Naelli smiled without sadness hiding behind it. Small, quiet, warm enough to soften 12 winters of loneliness. Outside, snow continued falling softly across Dust Creek while lantern light glowed through the cabin windows like